What's up, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here, and I am here to talk about some single issues of a comic book series. Last week I talked about the Back to School volume of New Mutants by Nunzio DeFlippis and Christina Weir, and the second half of that New Mutant series has never been collected in trade paperback. So I am going to be talking about the second half of that series in single issue form. This is issues 7 through 13 of that series, and I will quickly show you the covers of these comics. Most of these covers are by Chris Bachalo, however you say his name, but he doesn't actually do any of the interior work in this series, and I don't know right off the top of my head who does the interior work for these. Barberi and Randolph. I'm not going to look up these artists' names. That would take me like a third of this video. So basically, my thoughts on the second half of this series, and then this is the last cover here. My thoughts on the second half of this series is that while the first half was largely just introducing the cast of characters, this half is developing those characters. And a lot of Volume 1, or the Back to School volume, a lot of that volume was developing some of the characters. It was mostly just introducing them. So like David, or Prodigy as he's later known, he's introduced, but then he gets a little bit of development in the issues after he's introduced. But this group of issues is mostly just taking all these characters and kind of introducing some new relationships between them, and also introducing a few new characters. This group of issues introduces, I don't know if it's pronounced Anole or Annalie, but the lizard mutant, the one with the tongue, he's introduced in this group of issues, and also Surge, the final member of this New Mutants team. And you could be forgiven if you just read these 13 issues for not thinking that Surge is a very big part of this series, but she actually becomes a lot more important when the series becomes New X-Men Academy X. But she is introduced in this group, and Elixir, Josh, he is really developed quite a bit in this group of issues because he was introduced near the very end of the Back to School volume, and so he gets the most development out of any of these characters. And I will go ahead and say that something that I didn't really address when I reviewed Volume 1, or the Back to School volume, was that a lot of people probably won't dig this series. If you went back and found these issues in the back issue bins, or you saw the Back to School trade in the hidden shelf in your comic book shop, you might not dig this series because it's really leaning heavily towards the manga angle. It's really trying to lure in 13-year-old kids who are really into manga and maybe are really interested in superhero movies, because around the time that these comics were coming out, X2 had just come out in theaters, so maybe they're really interested in superheroes and they like superhero movies, but they're not sure where to go in comic books to get their superhero fix. This is trying to lure in that crowd. And so a lot of people who maybe aren't really into manga, like that particular demographic, they might not be as interested in this as that particular demographic. And some of the artwork does lean very heavily in that direction. I didn't mind it as much. It has a very fluid feeling to it, but I know a lot of people don't really go for that kind of style, and so this group of issues might not work for them at all. And that's really kind of true for the Back to School volume as well, even though I didn't mention that in that video. I don't have a whole lot more to say here. Basically, this is taking those characters who were introduced in the previous volume and then trying to establish some relationships between those characters, developing some of the personalities of these characters. And it also brings back Wolfsbane, and a lot of people, if you're a big fan of Wolfsbane, either from the 1980s New Mutant series or from more recent times, like Peter David's X-Factor series, you might not like what they do with Wolfsbane here, because she's basically the exact opposite of what her character was in previous appearances. She was always the shy, quiet girl. She was very heavily religious, almost to the point of being a caricature. If you go back and read some of Claremont's New Mutant stuff, it's a little absurd how hard he leans on her being a religious stereotype, and she is more of a stereotype than an actual character at times. These issues get rid of all of that, to the point of she doesn't even have her Scottish accent anymore, and now she wears leather, and she's a biker girl, and she's really flirty with one of the students, who, it's not as weird as it sounds, because he's only like 2 years younger than her. She's maybe 18, and he's like 16, so it's not as weird as it sounds. But if you're a fan of the character of Wolfsbane, I personally am not. I really couldn't stand her reading the the New Mutants comics from the 80s, if you are a fan of that character, you probably won't like what they did with her here. It really feels like they were thinking, okay, nobody cares about that character, and nobody has even seen her in a while. Let's bring her back and let's update her for the 21st century. And they do that, and then almost immediately afterwards, Peter David uses her in his post-House of M X Factor series, and he basically just blatantly contradicts everything that is established here and kind of takes the character back to where she was in the 1980s. And if you like Peter David, then you probably don't have a problem with that. I'm not as big of a Peter David fan as other people, but I, on the other hand, didn't really like how they took the character of Wolfsbane and just abandoned everything about that character and basically created a brand new character. Which is weird because I'm not even that much of a fan of the character of Wolfsbane, but if you're going to bring this character back, then actually bring that character back and don't just create a brand new character and say, look, it's Wolfsbane, when it really has no resemblance to the character of Wolfsbane. That's about all I have to say. This last issue here, I did want to quickly mention this. If you are a fan of the 1980s New Mutants series, you might want to track this issue down because it's basically a reuniting of the original New Mutants team. And if you didn't really care for this new version of the New Mutants that was the focus of this series, Prodigy, Wind Dancer, Wallflower, that group, if you didn't really care about them, you should definitely check out issue 13 of this series because those characters are barely even in this issue. Josh is in it more than the others, but the rest of the team is barely even in this book. And so if you were a big fan of the 1980s New Mutants, you should probably check out this issue. It's kind of sort of, I don't want to say a prologue, but it's kind of a sort of a prologue to the more recent New Mutant series that reunites this team from like post 2010 when they were on the Utopia Island working together. And I say it's not really a prologue because this came out so many years before that series. When this issue came out, nobody had any idea that they were going to be doing a reunion New Mutants series a few years later. But they did. And so if you are a big fan of the New Mutants from the 80s and you wanted a little bit of a New Mutants fix, this was a nice little fix for you at the time that this issue came out. And this also kind of deals with the aftermath of Grant Morrison's New X-Men, which I talked about a little bit in the final volume of Extreme X-Men. And this even sort of leads into the last issue of Extreme X-Men, where Danny and Sam talk about the possibility of Danny going back to be a full-time X-Man and actually going out into the field and stuff. That's kind of referenced here. So overall, I really like these issues. I really like the heavy emphasis on character stuff over plot stuff. There is plot here. There's stuff happening. There's action. There's adventure. But it much more heavily leans on character development and character building and just emphasizing character stuff. And I really like that in this series. I think that's why I like this series so much. And also there's a little bit of a nostalgia factor to it because when I first started reading X-Men comics, this series was just getting started. And so in a way, I feel like this is my X-Men era more so than any comic that's come out since then, even comics that might be technically better than this series. So those were my thoughts on issues 7 through 13 of this New Mutants series. And I'm really not sure what I'm going to be doing for next week. I could potentially go straight into the Academy X series, which is basically just the next volume of this series. It's really the same series, just with a name change. I'm really not sure. I'm going to do something in the mid-2000s, so that's going to be what I will be talking about next week. I'm still not entirely decided, but it'll be something. So that you have to look forward to next week, a little bit of a mystery. And I've got other videos coming out for the rest of this week, so be sure to check those out, and I will see you guys later. Have a great rest of the day.